Hey, welcome, Agents of Hope. We have been in the Old Testament. This is our Old Testament class 102. And if you remember the first week, we covered Genesis 1 through 11. We looked at the creation account and really how the world began to spiral out of control. And we see that after God had created this good creation, things just went south or were not working the way that they were supposed to work. And so we find in Genesis 12, we find that God is going to fix the world through a family, and it's going to be the family of Abraham, which if you trace the family of Abraham, it goes all the way to Jesus. And so as believers and followers of Jesus, we become a part of that family. And so today we are going to jump into what we call the Exodus stage. And so the Exodus stage covers roughly 1804 to 1405 BC. And so the books that are involved in this are Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these finish out the what's called the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. We ended Genesis with the death of Joseph, where we see Jacob and his family going into Egypt, and the Egyptians welcome them, and they're able to farm and use the land. And something that's, I think, really critical, important, that you have to remember that the whole Bible story is a story of not only rescue, but restoration and renewal. And we know that God is going to do this somehow through Abraham's family. And so Abraham's family goes into Egypt and will be there for the next 400 years. And what's interesting about that story is that while they're under the protection of Egypt, the promised land they're not going into yet, but in that land there's all kinds of strife and different small kingdoms. And so what this does, protecting them under Egypt, helps them to grow into really a mighty nation, a mighty people. And so some of the key people, obviously there's Moses. Moses is the one that is going to lead them out of bondage from Egypt. Obviously in the New Testament, Jesus is a Moses type character, or a Moses type character, and Jesus is going to lead his people out of slavery as well, a slavery of sin and death. And so and then there's Aaron and Miriam, Eleazar, Korah, Balaam, Phineas, Caleb, and Joshua. And so these are all some of the main characters within this time and within this stage. So some of the key events that we cover during the Exodus stage is that Israel's deliverance from Egypt, the building of the tabernacle, and that's going to play a big part. If you remember when we talked about in Genesis, when God created the heavens and the earth were like a tabernacle, God's creation. He had come into his presence, but after the garden, there's obviously sin has caused issues, but there's going to be a physical reminder of God's presence, and that will be the tabernacle. Also, we see in these books the law of Moses is going to be given, and these are ways to live life and how to live under a covenant relationship with God. We're going to talk about Israel's failure at Kadesh Barnea. That's where they had an opportunity to go into the promised land, and they were going to spy out the land, and instead they feared what the future held, and that ended up costing them a lot of people's lives, and also it cost them many years of wandering within the wilderness area. So the locations of the key events in this stage are Egypt, and then moving out into the Sinai wilderness. We find that the building of the tabernacle is at Mount Sinai. The giving of the law is at Mount Sinai as well. It's interesting that the law is given on this mountain. And what's interesting is that Jesus kind of speaks in the New Testament, sort of a mountain, but not a large mountain, more probably like a hill, but he gives sort of a refresher on the law and introduces even some new things. We have Israel's failure to enter the promised land at Kadesh Barnea, and that was near the promised land. That's before they head in. And then there's Israel's wanderings, and they wander all through the Sinai area, Paran, Moab, Edom, and Ammon. So there are some other important activities that take place during this time. God's going to provide manna for Israel. In other words, if there's, let's say there's 1 million people, some scholars think there's even more, but let's say there's even 2 million people. How are you going to feed all these people out in this wilderness who are not able to grow gardens, or, they're on the move? And so God is going to provide from them from heaven. God's going to command them to keep the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is something that's going to separate God's people from those that are not God's people. It was a time to rest not only the body, but your animals, to rest your fields. God's also going to give the 10 Commandments to his people, and those commandments sort of shape the whole life of Israel. And then also God's going to choose a successor. That's Joshua. Joshua becomes the successor to Moses, and that's important. So we're going to talk about Israel first, them as far as being slaves in Egypt. Sometimes, after Joseph died, the Bible tells us that the pharaohs forgot the relationship that Israel had with Egypt, and literally turned them into slaves. They were welcome guests, but now they were being treated as slaves and mistreated. And usually that's what happens in empires. And as empires grow, they enslave those that they believe they can enslave. They use different groups, and in this case, it is the Hebrew people that are enslaved. And so they turn the Israelites into slaves. And then there's the story of Moses. Moses would live in the palace. His story's somewhat interesting, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But God is going to remember his covenant with Abraham. Even though they've been in slavery for almost 400 years, he's going to remember his covenant. And because they're going to cry out within their slavery, and they're going to cry out to God. And so God is going to use Moses, and he would deliver them from Egypt. And the Exodus account tells us that that Pharaoh saw that there was too many of male children being born, and so he was going to have them killed by the midwives. But the midwives amongst the Hebrew people were not going to do this. And so Moses, as a baby, is put in a basket where he's discovered by an Egyptian princess. The princess takes Moses in as her own child. And so what's interesting is that we see the hand of God working throughout history. A lot of times events will take place that we don't think about, that we just think that it's normal things, but God is always working within history. God is always doing things. And so God is going to raise up Moses. And think about the education he's going to get, probably on things like warfare, leadership skills. These are things that he's going to use later on in his life. We know that when Moses was around 40 years of age, he began to take an interest in his people, and he saw an event take place where an Israeli slave was killed by an Egyptian guard, and so Moses kills this guard, but he has to run for his life into the wilderness, into Midian, and he's going to spend the next 40 years in Midian. And I think that's part of his education and training as well, because if he's going to bring Israel into the wilderness, Moses is going to have to know something about this wilderness. And so it's there that he marries his wife Zipporah. And then God begins to speak to Moses. And there's a story of the burning bush. And God tells Moses to take off his sandals because the ground that he's on is holy. And we know that wherever God's presence is, that's a holy place. And, you know, Moses is going to go back to Egypt, and he's going to challenge Pharaoh to let the people go. And of course, we know how that story goes. If we've read the account, Pharaoh has no reason to let the Jewish people go, because it's free labor. I mean, if you have 1 million slaves working for you, that's free labor. And so God is going to send some plagues. And something that I thought was really interesting, it's on our chart here, I'll just kind of bring this all up, is that God's going to bring a plague to try to change Pharaoh's heart. And each time Pharaoh's going to either do something about this plague that counteracts Moses. A couple times his heart is going to change, where he's going to say, yeah, I'll let them go, but, and then he changes his mind. And then we know the last plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh finally is defeated and lets the people go. But it's interesting when you look at these plagues that the Egyptians had many gods. They didn't have, like the Hebrew people, just one God, but they had a lot of gods. And so each one of the plagues really represents a god. So you have Osiris, who was the plague that was defeated was the water into blood. And then you have the frogs, and that the god that would be defeated there was Hecht, and Lice was Seb, and you kind of keep going down, and the 3 days of darkness was Ra, and then the death of the firstborn that would have defeated all of the gods. And so in one way, not only was God trying to change Pharaoh's heart to release the Egyptian people, but God was also sending a message to Egypt, to Pharaoh and his leadership, that the Hebrew God, this God is the one and true God. He's more powerful than these other gods. And so after the 10th plague, Pharaoh releases the Israelites, but then he changes his mind as the Israelites are fleeing, and the Israelites will go through the Red Sea, and then God will close up the Red Sea on them. And so we'll talk about Israel as far as on their way to Mount Sinai. When Israel left Egypt, they began their journey. And as we've said, the Israelites were being chased by Pharaoh and his army. And so God is going to destroy Pharaoh and that army so that they will no longer be bothered by the Egyptians. Once the Egyptians, as Israel is in the wilderness, and even, and this is going to happen on many occasions, but the first time happens when they think they're going to die at the Red Sea, and they think that Moses is just leading them into the wilderness to die, but God's going to do his saving acts. God is going to use a pillar of cloud and fire between the Egyptian army, and that's going to keep them safe. And again, we know what God does is he destroys them. 3 days after the Red Sea crossing, Israel runs out of water. Now, this landscape, that what we call wilderness. Part of the reason they probably call it a wilderness is because there's not a lot of things that are growing. Probably not a lot of access to water, especially if you're talking hundreds of thousands or even 1 million people. You're not going to have water. But God shows Moses a tree that would make the water sweet. And so Moses threw the tree into the water, and the water became drinkable. They had found this water source there. So God promised that if Israel would obey him, he would not bring the diseases on them that he had brought on Egypt. And so God is going to continue to say this throughout this journey, that, hey, listen, if you do what is right, God is going to take care of you. Well, the Israelites, they complain about food, and God is going to provide them manna, and so the manna would appear each morning. They were only supposed to take and gather what they needed, not to store up for additional days, except for on the day before the Sabbath, that they could collect a double portion. And so manna would become Israel's diet for the next 40 years. And God told Moses to have Israel observe the Sabbath day of rest on the 7th day of the week. We've kind of mentioned that's something that would identify the people of God from some of these other nations. So Israel continued through the wilderness. They would run out of water again, and the people threatened Moses. God told Moses to strike a rock that would provide water, and so Moses obeyed, and the rock produced it needed water. Israel's faith in God at this time was really weak. Even though God was providing in every way, they just kind of kept turning their heads away from God. And so in the area where they were at, the wilderness, there were other tribal groups that lived there, and the Amalekites attacked Israel while Israel was camped at Rephidim. And Israel won the battle with Joshua leading its army, and Aaron and Hur supported Moses' arm. And as long as they could keep his arm up, the army won. What I want you to take from this is that a lot of times we think that these military victories were things that Israel did, but ultimately the battles belonged to God. It was God that was doing the fighting, and so God would instruct Moses to write these things down, and they write them down so that people would not forget. So as they're camped in Sinai, this is about 3 months after Israel had left Egypt. There's 3 main events at Sinai that would define Israel's spiritual life. The first was the giving of the law, which is described the requirements for fellowship with God. The second was Israel's worship of the golden calf, which broke their fellowship with God. So we have 3 months after they come into the wilderness, God provides the law for them, how to shape their lives, what they should do or shouldn't do as a nation. And anytime a nation would come together, certainly you would want to have rules and regulations. And that's what God does. He says, hey, this is what covenant people look like. And right away, Israel will break that covenant by building this idol of a golden calf, and they're going to worship this idol. And then the third major thing there in Sinai was the construction of the tabernacle, which this was a way of restoring Israel's fellowship with God. It's a temporary way, and we know that ultimately Jesus is going to become our true tabernacle. So the commandment of the law, if obeyed, would keep Israel in fellowship with God. And so we have the 10 commandments. Have no other gods before the true God. Do not make graven images. Do not take God's name in vain. Keep the Sabbath. Honor your father and mother. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not lie. And do not covet. These were the 10. Now there's going to be more laws that he gives, but this was given actually twice to the people. We see it in Exodus, and then it reoccurs in the book of Deuteronomy. And then we have codes or other laws that dealt with special rules, ways that you might worship God, including some of the feasts and Levitical feasts and offerings. Then we have the social code in the law. There were basic rules about marriage, about health, sanitation, military service, and really other rules that would shape Israel as a nation. Well, while Moses was writing down these laws, the people got impatient with Moses, and this is where Aaron makes the calf, and they go and worship it. Now, the calf is, when we say it's an idol, we're not saying that they're worshiping a God that they don't know, but they're actually making an image probably of the true God, which God said, hey, don't do that. Don't make an image for me. And the reason you don't make an image is because he already has an image of himself. And that's us as people. When God created humans, he placed his image on us. We are God's image. And so we're called not to make other images. Well, they do, and they begin to worship it. And of course, that all goes bad. God is wanting to really destroy them, but Moses is going to intercede. When Moses comes back, he has them melt it down, and he makes them drink the golden calf that they used. And so it's just a departure from what God had for them. Well, Israel needed a place where they could offer sacrifices and worship God, because this golden calf was not it. But they construct this tabernacle. The tabernacle is going to point to future things, but they don't necessarily know how this is all going to work out. We know it's going to point to Jesus. But tabernacle had an outer section, an inner section, and the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies was a place where God's presence would reside at times. So here we have some of the dimensions of the different rooms, and you can read that. And then in the Holy of Holies, they would put the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant was a small box made of acacia wood and gold that held the tablets of the Ten Commandments and some other objects. And so it's just a description here of all the ways that they were called to make this. There's also descriptions here. I'll let you look at this. We don't necessarily need to go over this, but how the high priest, what they were to wear, who they were to come from, the tribe of Levi, their duties. The priests and the Levites become really the inner workings of ministering to the nation. Ultimately, in the New Testament, Peter is going to borrow from this idea that just as the Levites were serving and ministering to the different tribes of Israel, so we are going to minister to one another as well. So in these books in Leviticus, we have the different ways to fellowship God, the different feasts, and so we also have things such as the 7-year Sabbath, the 50-year Sabbath, the atonement for the nation. And so there's all kinds of different feasts. And but these were ways for them to remember who they were as a people, ways to worship God and to honor God. Now let's talk about Israel on their way to Kadesh Barnea from Sinai. That's becomes an important story. So Moses tried to get his brother-in-law Hobab to guide the Israelites through the wilderness, and Hobab refuses at first, but then agrees. And so God continued to lead Israel faithfully with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And along the way, the people of Israel still continue to complain. They complained that they wanted things to be like they were when they were back as slaves in Egypt. So imagine you've come out of slavery. You now have freedom, but there's things where you're thinking, when are we going to eat? What are we going to do? And yet God continues to provide. He provides food. He provides water. He tells you how to live. But they still want to go back to Egypt. And this put a heavy burden on Moses. And the Israelites would complain. They even complained that God was feeding them the same food every day. And, they chose to complain, and they wanted meat, so God sends them quail, and God would strike down those who were complaining with a plague. And so we have Aaron and Miriam. They too would speak against Moses and his leadership. They would say that he had married a woman from Ethiopia, and so we find that God punishes Miriam with leprosy. Aaron asked Moses to pray for her healing. And so after 7 days of purification, Miriam was restored. Here's some questions that I'd like for you to work through as a class. So let's move on now to Kadesh Barnea. So Kadesh Barnea, it was a location outside of the Promised Land. And so when Israel arrived in Kadesh Barnea, God told them to take some spies to spy out the land. And so these spies from each tribe went into the Promised Land. And when they came back, there were two different reports that were given. 10 of the 12 spies said that Israel, we just can't take the land. The people are too big, too strong. But 2 of the 12 spies said that Israel could take the land because the Lord was with them. They knew that if God had sent them to this land, they knew that they could take it. And that was Joshua and Caleb. And so because of this event, God is going to punish them. Israel, because they refused to enter into Canaan, God is going to make them really now for the next 38 years wander in the wilderness. And so this is a sad moment in Israel's history. They're filled with unbelief. And God is going to say, listen, no one over 20 years of age except Joshua and Caleb, because they were the 2 spies who said we can do this, they're not going to enter into the Promised Land. And so the wilderness will become a wasteland for everybody 20 years of age or older. And so God's going to wait it out, which is a reminder to us that God calls for faithfulness more than success. In other words, God wants you to be faithful, even if it takes a long time, even if you can't see what's ahead of you. God is calling for faithfulness. And so the 10 spies who said Israel could not take the land would die of plague. Israel then left Kadesh Barnea to begin 38, well, probably now a little over 38 years, but our text says about 40 years in the wilderness. So from there, Israel will lead Kadesh Barnea in numbers to the banks of Jordan. And Israel had changed its mind about entering the promised land against Moses' warning. They tried to take Canaan in their own strength. So they were going to go in and disregard what God had said. And the Canaanites and the Amalekites drove them away. So you're not going to outthink God. But they tried. Israel was not consistent in working out its obedience to their covenant. And so although they had refused to enter the promised land, they chose to take the Sabbath seriously. Moses and the congregation stoned a man who worked on the Sabbath because they saw that as an open rebellion against God. And then there's a story of Korah, a descendant of Levi. Korah gathered 250 men to rebel against Moses, and God caused the earth to open up and swallow Korah and his followers for their rebellion. And yet, after this event, they continued to complain. I wonder if the books, these 4 books that we've been talking about, should be called the books of complaining, because the Israelite people just continued to complain and complain and complain. A lot of times Moses and Aaron had to defend their leadership and why God had put them there. It's just a continuous story. But God continues to be faithful. As close as God, or as close as Moses was with God, Moses even sinned. God had commanded Moses to make water come from a rock at Kadesh, and Moses struck the rock instead. But God told him exactly what to do, and he didn't do it the way he was supposed to. And so Moses himself is going to be barred from going into the promised land. Imagine what that must have felt like. You lead people who are ungrateful, who are not walking with God. You lead them, and because of a mistake that you make, you're not able to see God's promise either. And so, but Moses will be able at least to look into the promised land. Eventually, Aaron is going to die, and his son Eleazar is going to take his place as a priest. And God is going to continue to punish Israel for their rebellion. And so we have a lot of different things that go on in this book. There's an interesting story about Balaam and his donkey, and cursings, and Balaam's actually mentioned in the New Testament 3 times. Aaron's grandson Phinehas, the priest, saved Israel by executing a prince from the tribe of Simeon and his lover from Midian. This was a sign of God's judgment for men of Israel joining with foreign women. They were not to intermarry. And so, God takes his covenant with his people very seriously. There's a second census of Israel that was taken. It was prepared before they enter into the promised land. This time, the number of males aged 20 and older who would serve in the military was a little over 601,000, almost 602,000. But no one in Israel was alive who had been over 20 at that time of the Kadesh rebellion, except Moses, Caleb, and Joshua. Everybody else had died. And so Moses showed God's concern for widows and orphans when he granted the request of 5 daughters. The daughters of Zelophehad had lost their father. And of course, during that time, land and possession would go to the males, but these daughters had no male father in their family line, so they're allowed to inherit land themselves. Moses transfers his authority to Joshua, because Joshua is going to lead them into the promised land. And God told Moses to select 1,000 warriors from each of the 12 tribes to go into battle against Midian. And they were to be God's judgment against Midian for Midian's refusal to let Israel pass through their land. And so Israel is going to win that battle. So we have the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh asked Moses for permission to settle in Gilead, which is east of the promised land. Moses agreed with the conditions as long as they would, help fight. And they would do things. They would set up cities of refuge, and these cities of refuge would be places where if somebody accidentally killed someone, you could go to and be safe and protected from that. So anyhow, let's talk about Israel on the eastern bank. At the eastern bank of the Jordan River, Moses delivers his farewell message to Israel. And Moses' first message told about the covenant between God and Israel. It then told about the history of God and his acts on behalf of Israel during the Exodus. And so Moses' second message told about the special rules of the covenant. And then his third message told about the terms of the covenant. It also told about what would happen to Israel in both the near and the distant future. So there's things like blessings and curses. If you obey God's word, if you're faithful to the covenant, you will find blessings. But if you're not, you'll find cursings. And so Moses now is going to bless the 12 tribes, and we have an account where Moses composes a song of praise and warning to Israel. And so Moses then dies, and he's buried somewhere in the plain of Moab. And the Exodus was finished. Israel is now prepared to take the land, and we're going to talk about that next week. Here's some questions I'd like for you to work on, and these are questions that we can discuss in class as well. So that is our Exodus stage, and so hopefully you'll appreciate the journey, and hopefully you've learned something along the way. Until next time, we will talk to you later.